The judge stared at the file for so long that even the courtroom clerk stopped typing. I remember every second of that silence. My husband Brian was still smiling. His mother Donna sat beside him with her arms folded, looking at me the way she always had, like I was a disappointment that somehow refused to go away. The attorney Brian had hired, one of the most expensive divorce lawyers in Northern Virginia, leaned back confidently in his chair. Then the judge looked up. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said slowly. The attorney frowned. The judge turned another page. A strange expression crossed his face. Confusion. Then surprise. Then something else. Respect. The lawyer suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, may I see that file?" The judge handed it over. The man looked at the first page. His face drained of color. "Oh my God," he whispered. The entire courtroom went silent. He looked directly at Brian. "You never told me about this." My husband's smile disappeared. And for the first time that morning, I knew the next few minutes were going to change his life forever. But to understand how we ended up in that Virginia courtroom, you need to understand what happened long before the divorce papers arrived. My name is Karen Mitchell. I was 42 years old when my marriage ended. For 20 years I served my country. Most people who knew me casually assumed I worked an ordinary military administrative job. I never corrected them. I wasn't interested in impressing anyone. After 2 decades in uniform, I'd learned something important. The people who truly matter don't need constant reminders of your accomplishments. Unfortunately, my husband never understood that. Brian and I met when we were both young. He was charming, funny, ambitious, and full of confidence. Back then, I admired that confidence. Years later, I would discover the difference between confidence and arrogance. When we married, he promised he supported my military career. And for a while he did. At least on the surface. But military life is demanding. There were deployments, long hours, training assignments, missed birthdays, missed holidays, missed anniversaries. Every military family makes sacrifices. I understood that. What I didn't realize was that Brian kept score. Every time I missed an event because of duty. Every time I received a promotion. Every time someone thanked me for my service. A little more resentment grew inside him. At first it showed up as jokes. "Your real spouse is the government. You spend more time with the military than with me." People laughed. I laughed too. But over the years the jokes became criticism, then bitterness, then hostility. By the time I retired from active service, our marriage felt less like a partnership and more like a ceasefire. I hoped retirement would help. I thought we would finally have time to reconnect. Instead, things got worse. Without my military schedule to blame, Brian found new reasons to complain. According to him, I was emotionally distant, too independent, too disciplined, too focused on planning everything. No matter what I did, it wasn't enough. Donna, my mother-in-law, didn't help. She had never approved of me. In her mind, a wife should revolve around her husband. I never did. Not because I didn't love Brian, but because I had spent my adult life standing on my own 2 feet. Donna interpreted that as disrespect. Whenever family gathered for holidays, she found subtle ways to remind me. Some women know how to prioritize family. Military women are different. Karen always did things her own way. I usually stayed quiet. Arguing only made things worse. Then 6 months before the divorce, everything changed. Brian started working late. A lot. At first I believed him. Then I noticed inconsistencies. Phone calls that ended when I entered the room. Weekend meetings that weren't actually meetings. Receipts that didn't make sense. I didn't hire a private investigator. I didn't confront him dramatically. I simply paid attention. And eventually the truth revealed itself. There was another woman. When I discovered it, I felt surprisingly calm. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. But after years of military service, I had learned something about crises. Panic never improves the outcome. So I gathered information. I documented facts. And I waited. 3 weeks later, Brian handed me divorce papers. He acted as though he was doing me a favor. "I think this is best for both of us." I simply nodded. That seemed to irritate him. He wanted anger, tears, begging. Instead, I signed the documents and began preparing. Not for a fight. For the truth. Then came the hearing. Brian arrived with his expensive attorney. Donna arrived dressed like she was attending a victory celebration. I arrived alone. No lawyer. No entourage. Just me. The moment Brian saw me enter the courtroom, he laughed. "No lawyer," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Then he shook his head. "You're finished." Donna smiled. I stood there alone in civilian clothes. For a moment I looked exactly like what they thought I was. A defeated woman. An abandoned wife. An easy target. The hearing began. Documents were reviewed. Questions were asked. Then the judge reached a section of the file that neither Brian nor his attorney expected. His eyes narrowed. He turned another page. And another. The attorney requested permission to examine it. The moment he did, the color left his face. He looked at Brian in disbelief. "You never told me about this." The judge adjusted his glasses. Then he looked directly at me, and everything in that courtroom changed. The judge did not speak right away. That was what made it worse for Brian. If the judge had scolded him, Brian could have argued. If the attorney had objected, Brian could have whispered some excuse. If I had cried, Brian could have called me unstable, emotional, dramatic, the same words he had used for years whenever I refused to bend. But nobody moved. The judge read in silence. Brian's attorney kept his eyes on the file, turning pages with a hand that no longer looked steady. Donna leaned forward. "What is it?" she whispered. Brian ignored her. His confidence was still there, but it had begun to crack at the edges. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. He hated not knowing something, especially something about me. For most of our marriage, Brian had believed he understood my military career. To him it was simple. I wore a uniform. I followed orders. I collected a government paycheck. That was all. He never asked much about my assignments. He never wanted details about the cases I worked on, the units I supported, or the decisions I helped carry out. Whenever I tried to explain, his eyes drifted toward the television, his phone, or whatever part of the world felt more interesting than his wife. So I stopped explaining. It was easier that way. And maybe, if I am honest, I was tired. Military service teaches you how to keep going when your body aches, when your heart breaks, when you're afraid, and when nobody at home understands the cost of what you carry. I learned that lesson young. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where most people measured a woman's success by how well she kept a house, raised children, supported her husband, and never made too much noise. My father worked in a factory. My mother cleaned offices at night. We were not wealthy, but we were proud. When I told them I wanted to join the military, my mother cried. My father stared out the kitchen window for a long time before saying, "Then do it right." That was his blessing. Not warm, not poetic, but real. So I did it right. I showed up early. I listened more than I spoke. I studied regulations until my eyes burned. I learned procedure documentation, evidence, chain of command contracts, ethics investigations, and military justice. Most people saw the uniform. They did not see the years behind it. The late nights reviewing files. The briefings. The inspections. The investigations that required precision, because one wrong sentence could ruin an innocent person or protect a guilty one. Over time, I became someone commanders trusted when the situation was complicated and the stakes were high. I never bragged about that at home. When I met Brian, I thought his world and mine could fit together. He sold insurance then and had the natural charm of a man who could make a stranger feel known in 5 minutes. He brought me coffee during my long training weeks. He wrote sweet notes. He told everyone he was proud of me. I believed him. But pride is easy when someone's success still feels small enough not to threaten you. The first time I outranked the image Brian had of me, something changed. He smiled for photos, but later in the car he said, "Don't let it go to your head." The second time I was recognized publicly, he joked at dinner, "Careful, Karen might start giving us orders." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because wives are often taught to soften the sharpness of their own pain. Donna laughed the loudest. From that point on, she treated my service like a character flaw. At Thanksgiving, when I came home exhausted from a demanding assignment, she said, "Some women are married to their husbands. Karen is married to the Pentagon." Brian did not defend me. He just reached for more mashed potatoes. That was how it usually went. 1,000 little betrayals. Small enough to deny, heavy enough to remember. Years passed that way. Then came Brian's affair. Her name was Melissa. She worked with him at a regional insurance office in Fairfax. She was younger, bright, flattering, and very impressed by him. That mattered to Brian. By then, he did not want a partner. He wanted an audience. I found out because he became careless. A hotel charge, a message preview, a restaurant receipt for 2 on a night he claimed he was meeting a client. I did not scream. I made copies. Not because I wanted revenge, but because truth has a way of disappearing when dishonest people control the paperwork. When Brian filed for divorce, his plan was clear. He wanted the house. He wanted most of the retirement funds. He wanted to portray me as cold, absent, and impossible to live with. He believed my silence meant weakness. Donna believed it too. She encouraged him. "Take control now," she told him once, not realizing I heard her from the hallway. "Women like Karen only understand power." She was wrong. Women like me understand patience. Back in the courtroom, Brian's attorney finally set the file down. He looked shaken. The judge turned to him. "Counselor, were you aware of Mrs. Mitchell's professional background?" The attorney swallowed. "No, Your Honor." Brian snapped his head toward him. What professional background? The judge looked at my husband for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Mr. Mitchell, it appears there are several things about your wife you never bothered to learn. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Brian stared at the judge as though he had misheard him. What does that mean? He asked. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Brian's attorney. Counselor, I strongly suggest you review the remainder of Mrs. Mitchell's record before proceeding further. The attorney opened the file again. I watched him carefully. For the first time that day, he wasn't acting like a man who expected to win. He was acting like a man who had just discovered he had walked into a storm wearing a paper raincoat. Brian shifted in his chair. Somebody tell me what's going on. Nobody did. The attorney continued reading, page after page. Then he exhaled slowly. Oh no! Donna grabbed Brian's arm. What is it? Still no answer. The judge finally looked at me. Mrs. Mitchell, before we continue, I need to confirm a few details. Yes, Your Honor. During your military service, you completed advanced legal administration and compliance training. Yes, sir. And later supervised multiple investigative and regulatory review programs. Yes, sir. The judge nodded. The attorney closed his eyes briefly. Brian looked completely confused. To him, those words sounded boring, technical, unimportant. But anyone familiar with military administration understood exactly what they meant. For years, I had worked alongside legal teams, investigators, auditors, commanders, and compliance specialists. I knew how records were created, how evidence was documented, how financial discrepancies were uncovered, how people attempted to hide information, and most importantly, how often they failed. Brian had assumed that because I wasn't a lawyer, I couldn't possibly understand the system. That assumption was about to become very expensive. The judge reviewed several documents. Then he asked a question that instantly changed the direction of the hearing. Mr. Mitchell, did you disclose all marital assets in your filing? Brian answered immediately. Of course. The judge looked down. Are you certain? Yes. The attorney suddenly leaned toward Brian. His voice was low, urgent. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the panic. Brian frowned. What? The attorney whispered again. This time Brian's face lost some color. The judge folded his hands. Mrs. Mitchell has submitted additional financial records. Brian turned toward me. For the first time all morning he looked nervous. Not angry. Not arrogant. Nervous. That was new. Because the truth was simple. I hadn't spent months preparing a revenge plan. I had spent months collecting facts. Every bank statement. Every transfer. Every retirement account summary. Every tax document. Every suspicious transaction. After discovering the affair, I had stopped assuming and started verifying. Military service had taught me something valuable. Facts survive where emotions fail. Brian had underestimated that. The judge continued reviewing the documents. One transfer led to another. One account connected to another. The pattern became obvious. Money had been moved. Not illegally at first, but certainly suspiciously. Several accounts listed in court filings did not match the records now sitting on the judge's desk. Brian shifted again. His attorney looked like a man developing a headache. Donna finally lost patience. This is ridiculous, she snapped. The judge looked at her. Ma'am, one more interruption and I'll ask you to leave. She immediately fell silent. For the first time in 20 years, someone had refused to be intimidated by Donna Mitchell. I wish I could say I enjoyed it. But honestly, I didn't. Because sitting there watching Brian unravel, I wasn't feeling victorious. I was feeling disappointed. 20 years together. And somehow we had arrived here. A courtroom. An affair. Hidden accounts. Lawyers. Accusations. Silence. It wasn't supposed to end this way. The judge reviewed another document. Then another. The attorney requested a brief recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. The moment we stepped outside the courtroom, Brian approached me. His confidence was gone. Karen. I looked at him. What? Did you do this? I almost laughed. Do what? All these records. I stared at him. They're bank statements, Brian. His face tightened. You've been investigating me. No. I shook my head. I've been paying attention. That answer seemed to hit harder than anything else. Because deep down, Brian knew it was true. He had spent years believing I wasn't watching. That I was too busy. Too distracted. Too trusting. The reality was much simpler. I had seen everything. I just hoped he would stop before it reached this point. Behind him, Donna emerged from the courtroom. She looked shaken. Not angry. Actually shaken. Karen, she said carefully. I couldn't remember the last time she had spoken my name that gently. What? She hesitated. then asked the one question I never expected to hear. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her. "Tell you what?" "Everything." For a moment nobody spoke. Then I gave the only honest answer. "Because nobody ever asked." The recess ended. We returned to the courtroom. The judge took his seat. The attorney looked exhausted. Then the judge reviewed the latest findings and adjusted his glasses. What he said next made Brian's attorney close his file completely. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked defeated. Brian's attorney slowly closed the file and placed both hands on the table. That single gesture told me everything. The fight was over. The only question remaining was how much damage would be left when the dust settled. The judge looked across the courtroom. "Mr. Mitchell, before I make any determinations, I want to give you one final opportunity to clarify your financial disclosures." Brian swallowed. His attorney immediately leaned toward him. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. "Tell the truth." "Now, before this gets worse." Brian looked stunned. For perhaps the first time in his life, charm wasn't helping him. Confidence wasn't helping him. Excuses weren't helping him. Facts were standing in the middle of the room, and facts don't negotiate. The judge waited. Brian cleared his throat. "There may have been some accounts I forgot to include." The courtroom remained silent. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Forgot?" Brian glanced at his attorney. The attorney looked away. That answer told him everything. The judge reviewed another document, then another. Finally he spoke. "The evidence indicates multiple transfers made shortly before the divorce filing." Brian said nothing. "The evidence further suggests that marital assets were moved into accounts not disclosed to this court." Still nothing. I watched the man I had once loved sit frozen in his chair. Years earlier, Brian had been the kind of person who could light up a room. People liked him, trusted him, believed him. Maybe that's why he had convinced himself he could manipulate reality. People often mistake a pleasant personality for integrity. They are not the same thing. The judge continued. "Mr. Mitchell, this court takes financial transparency very seriously." Donna suddenly stood. "Your Honor, my son isn't a criminal." The judge's expression hardened. "Ma'am, sit down." She sat immediately. For the first time in 20 years, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not fear for herself, fear for Brian. Because suddenly she understood something. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about consequences. The hearing continued for nearly 2 hours. Financial records were reviewed. Statements were compared. Dates were verified. Each new document seemed to confirm the same pattern. Money had been moved. Information had been withheld. And Brian had hoped nobody would notice. His attorney finally requested permission to speak privately with his client. The judge granted another brief recess. As soon as we stepped into the hallway, Brian rounded on his attorney. "You said we were fine." The attorney looked exhausted. "I said we were fine based on the information you gave me." Brian opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say. Because the attorney was right. You can't build a defense on information your client hides from you. I stood several feet away near a courthouse window. Outside, the spring sunlight painted the parking lot gold. People came and went. Cars passed. Life continued. For a moment I felt strangely detached from everything, as though I were watching someone else's story. Then I heard my name. "Karen!" It was Donna. I turned. She looked older than she had that morning. Not physically. Emotionally. The certainty that had always defined her was gone. "I need to ask you something." I waited. "Did you know this would happen?" I thought about the question, then answered honestly. "No." She frowned. "You didn't." I knew the truth would come out. Her eyes dropped toward the floor. For years, Donna had assumed the worst about me. She thought my military discipline meant I lacked compassion. She thought independence meant selfishness. She thought strength meant arrogance. Standing there in the courthouse hallway, she finally seemed unsure. And uncertainty was something she wasn't used to carrying. The hearing resumed. Everyone returned to their seats. The judge reviewed his final notes. Then he delivered his ruling. The court ordered a complete forensic accounting review. Additional assets would be examined. Financial penalties related to non-disclosure would be considered. Most importantly, the division of property would proceed based on verified records rather than Brian's original disclosures. The impact was immediate. Brian's shoulders slumped. His attorney nodded quietly. The fight was effectively finished. The judge wasn't punishing him. The judge was simply insisting on the truth. And sometimes truth feels like punishment when you've spent too long hiding from it. After the ruling, people slowly began leaving the courtroom. Brian remained seated, staring at the table. Donna sat beside him. Neither spoke. For a long moment I considered walking away without saying anything. But 20 years deserved at least one final act of grace, so I approached. Brian looked up. His eyes were red. Not from tears, from exhaustion. "I never thought you'd do this," he said quietly. I studied him. Then I answered, "I didn't do this, Brian." He looked confused. I continued, "You made choices." The words hung between us. Simple, undeniable, true. For the first time all day he didn't argue. Outside the courthouse the sky was clear. Inside a marriage had officially ended. But something else had ended too. The lies. The pretending. The years of being underestimated. And for the first time in a very long while I felt free. 3 weeks after the hearing, Brian called me. I almost didn't answer. The divorce process was nearly complete. The forensic accounting review had confirmed everything the court suspected. Hidden accounts had been uncovered. Financial disclosures had been corrected. Property division had been finalized. The legal battle was over. Or at least I thought it was. When I picked up the phone, Brian was quiet for several seconds. "Karen." "Yes." "I owe you an apology." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. Summer sunlight filled my small Virginia townhouse. For the first time in years, the house felt peaceful. Not lonely, peaceful. Brian took a deep breath. "I spent so much time being angry at you that I stopped seeing who you really were." I didn't respond. Not because I disagreed, but because some truths don't need help arriving. I kept telling myself you thought you were better than everyone else. His voice cracked slightly. "The truth is, I was jealous." That wasn't the answer I expected. Of all the excuses Brian could have offered, jealousy hadn't been one of them. "I was proud of you at first," he continued. "Then your career kept growing. People respected you, trusted you, and instead of being proud, I started comparing myself to you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that surprised me even more. "I never cheated because you weren't enough." I closed my eyes. "Then why?" "Because I wanted someone to make me feel important." The honesty hurt, but there was something strangely healing about hearing it. Not because it erased the damage, nothing could, but because after years of excuses I was finally hearing the truth. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. For the first time in years we spoke like two human beings instead of two opponents. When the call ended, I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Sad for what we'd lost. Sad for what we might have been. But also grateful, because resentment is a heavy thing to carry. And I was finally setting it down. A month later, another unexpected visitor appeared at my door. Donna. I nearly dropped my coffee when I opened it. She stood there holding a small container. A homemade peach cobbler. The same dessert she had brought to every family gathering for 20 years. For a second, neither of us knew what to say. Then she handed it to me. This seemed easier than showing up empty-handed. I actually laughed, and somehow that broke the tension. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once cried after some of her cruelest comments. Now she looked uncomfortable, vulnerable, human. Finally she spoke. "I wasn't fair to you." The words came out slowly, as though she'd practiced them. "I judged you before I ever knew you." I listened quietly. "I thought strong women didn't need kindness." Her eyes filled with tears. "I was wrong." That sentence carried 20 years of history, 20 years of assumptions, 20 years of unnecessary conflict. I reached across the table and touched her hand. Not because she deserved forgiveness. Not because I owed her anything, but because I was tired of carrying old wounds. And because forgiveness is sometimes a gift we give ourselves. Donna cried. I cried. For the first time in 2 decades, neither of us was trying to win. We were simply trying to understand. After she left, I sat alone for a long time, thinking, reflecting, remembering. The courtroom, the marriage, the affair, the lies, the humiliation, the silence, the revelations, all of it. People often imagine revenge as a dramatic moment, a victory speech, a public humiliation, a final crushing defeat. But real life rarely works that way. The greatest victory I experienced wasn't watching Brian lose in court. It wasn't seeing his attorney panic. It wasn't hearing the judge rule in my favor. The greatest victory was discovering that my worth had never depended on anyone else's opinion. Not Brian's, not Donna's, not society's, not even the military's. My value existed long before any title, promotion, award, or courtroom decision. And so does yours. If this story teaches anything, let it be this. Never underestimate someone simply because they are quiet. Never assume a calm person is a weak person. Never mistake kindness for incompetence. And never judge another person's sacrifices when you haven't walked their path. Respect is not something we earn through fear. It grows through understanding. Families don't survive because one person controls everyone else. They survive when people choose honesty, accountability, and grace. Brian and I never reunited. Some stories aren't meant to end that way. But we found peace. And sometimes peace is the happy ending. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on someone in your life who may be carrying burdens you cannot see. A little understanding can change a relationship forever. And if you've ever been underestimated, remember this: your quiet strength may be far greater than anyone realizes. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, redemption, and second chances. The end.